Well, good morning or good afternoon for you, Dr. David Best. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are thrilled today to be getting to talk to Dr. David Best. I want to briefly tell you who he is, if by some chance you don't know. Here in the recovery housing ecosystem world, he is very well known to us and really someone we're thrilled to have the chance to connect with. Dr. Best is a professor and director of the Center for Addiction Recovery Research, which is CAR, at Leeds Trinity University. He is also honorary professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University and honorary associate professor in Eastern Health Clinical School at Monash University in Melbourne. He is also president of Recovery Outcomes Institute in Florida. Dr. Best has published more than 200 peer-reviewed papers, well more than 200, I think, at this point, in the areas of substance use.
255.
55. Gosh, that's extraordinary. 255 publications that are peer-reviewed in the areas of substance use, offending, recovery, as well. He's also authored or co-authored and edited 8 books and more than 70 book chapters and technical reports. Dr. Best's primary current area of work is around recovery and specifically in the area of recovery capital, which we're thrilled and delighted to get to chat with him about today. Welcome, Dr. Best. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Leah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. And you guys, those who don't know me, my name is Leah Davies. I'm the Director of Programs at the Cause Change Collaborative. So thank you again for your pioneering work in recovery capital research, which has been a guide for many of us as we attempt to make positive differences here in this field. In our work, we're aware that recovery is an intrinsically social process in which, of course, it requires both personal commitment and determination, which you hear a lot about in the world beyond recovery, but it also, we know, absolutely indicates important need for support from others, including peers in recovery, right? The best experts of all, including connection to community members and to a bigger community overall, as well as from other recovery support, such as recovery housing. So, and I know you know all those things so well. If you were in a passing conversation, though, with someone who wasn't as familiar, and you only had a brief minute or so to update them, how would you describe recovery capital or explain it?
Basically, it's like a bank account. If you think of it as a bank account, and there's a debit overdraft part, which is if you like, the barriers to recovery and the unmet needs people have, all the really acute, difficult things, criminal justice involvement, housing problems, caught up in networks of other drug users or social isolation. But then, and we traditionally, that's what gets measured in acute clinical services. And they measure all these bad things, and success is getting rid of them. But it only takes a passing familiarity with recovery to realize that what sustains people in recovery is not getting rid of what's below the line, but building what's above the line. And in essence, there's 2 ways of saying pretty much the same thing. It varies person to person, but fundamentally, what predicts long-term recovery is jobs, friends, and houses, or to phrase it another way, somewhere to live, someone to love, and something to do. And there's the golden threads of virtually all of the recovery and recovery capital research is basically around the idea that nobody does it alone. It's an intrinsically social process. And as we were discussing just before you started the recording, it's almost layered. So the person has to be motivated and has to be engaged and has to build their own internal qualities. But the catalyst for a lot of that is who they spend time with, and then the social context that affords the opportunities to make positive changes and sustainable change.
Right. Beautiful. Yeah, I like that that relatively straightforward synopsis. So somewhere to live, someone to love, and something to do. That feels really intuitively clear, right? Like that makes so much sense. It's such an important framing.
Well,
so
and
thank you.
It's almost in the right order. I did some work with the Phoenix who do recovery exercise and sport involvement in the United States. And they would add an element of psychological safety has to come at the start. And it seems to me like there's foundational things about physical safety and psychological safety, particularly for people with histories of mental health problems and trauma. Some of those safety components are crucial. Recovery is a journey over time, and I
Mhm.
think it's really important. Will change over time, and we typically think that over the course of a 5 year journey, people go from having very strong, basic, low level Maslow hierarchy needs around safety, social support, sense of belonging, a positive sense of identity, that then transitions more into meaning and purpose and bigger picture aspirations. So that at the end of roughly 5 years, recovery can be seen as being self determining or self sustaining. In other words, well, right at the start, people may well need to do 90 meetings in 90 days, be in a recovery house completely surrounded by other
There's
people
a
in
slight freeze. Oh, you're
recovery.
back. Okay.
That will change over time. Recovery is a transitional identity. Recovery is a kind of transitional identity. You don't want it to be a permanent priority in how people see themselves. You know, for
Mm,
some people it will be, but for the majority of
sure.
people, it will become a brick in the wall, but not the main brick, as their primary identity becomes worker, mother, brother,
Hmm.
partner, neighbor, friend, all of those things that complex identities as people build that sense of meaning and purpose in their lives.
Right. It's part of the identity, but not the entire. That's a really good, yeah, a really good
And I
way to
think
look
what
at it.
happens early and it should diminish. So probably over the first 6 months to a year, recovery should become a very strong identity. And in a research study we did in therapeutic communities in Australia about 10 years ago, we interviewed people at the start of their recovery journey when they went into a therapeutic community, 6 months later and 6 months after that. And the single biggest predictor of not relapsing was the emergence of a strong recovery identity. However,
Right.
we would argue that beyond that 1 year point, it's probably a good thing for recovery identity, maybe to become more and more of a background thing as other new life identities begin to take
Right.
hold. And, you know, there's a social identity theory that would suggest that multiple pro social positive identities is a strong predictor of well being, and that
Hmm.
effectively having all your eggs in one basket of identity is a big risk to long term well being.
Really fascinating. And you're already moving into this other question that we had for you related to these domains of recovery capital, which I appreciate because it's a
Yeah.
complex thing, recovery, right? And as you say, moving into the other parts of life in a way that's more that are might people might identify themselves differently as a primary identifier instead of a person in recovery. So you know that at Cause Change Collaborative, we've historically measured people's recovery capital through the original assessment of recovery capital, and
Yeah.
also we're really interested in several all of the other measures which have come since that time, including many that you have created yourself. We've utilized the BARC 10 by our board member, Dr. Corey Vilsant. I know you all know each other. And also, we're really excited to be working with you moving forward around some of your assessments that are targeting the peer workforce and folks who are might be in recovery themselves and working with others. Um, can you tell us a little bit about the domains of recovery capital that are part of the REC cap, so folks who have a bit more could have a bit more understanding about the importance of recovery planning and navigational support to support those domains?
I think it's important to say that the, there are potentially about four main domains that people have used traditionally. So they would be personal, social, community or cultural and physical. So in the original work by Bob Granfield and William Cloud, they went for those four dimensions. But they were
Right.
very tentative at that stage. And when William Cloud and Bill White wrote a paper in 2008, they simplified that to three: personal, social, community. And in that
Hmm.
2008 paper, they made a very big point of saying, look, if we know people's strengths as well as their pathologies and deficits, we can care plan much more effectively on that basis. And in essence, my first contribution to this discussion was effectively to test that three-part model. So I had data
Hmm.
from work I'd done in Birmingham and Glasgow in the UK, and Alexandra Lodi had data from New York about recovery pathways. And we kind of merged the two lots of data. And effectively, we came up with a model of three parts: personal recovery capital, which is like, if you like, internal qualities. And the five we listed were coping skills, resilience, self esteem, self efficacy, and communication skills. The other two were social networks. And we've known for a long time, recovery housing, as I'm sure you know, that people will frequently refer to it as the social model. Part of my
Right.
own upbringing in the UK as an academic was around therapeutic communities, which is the idea of community as method. It's the social involvement that creates the change process in people. And
Hmm.
community capital was something that was kind of understated in the earlier iterations, but really about what's around you that you can tap into to support that journey.
Hmm.
And as we've moved forward, we increasingly think of, for people with high capital at baseline, that personal capital is something you can start from. But the vast majority of people I've worked with, at the point they start their recovery journey, they either didn't have much capital to start with, or they have lost what they had in the course of their addiction career. You know, thinking of things like jobs and positive relationships and
Hmm.
homes and all those kind of things. And so, in essence, the model would be, well, for people who don't have those internal qualities to start with, you can't kind of expect them to magic them up. So it's through relationships primarily with peers, and it's through assertive linkage to community resources that people are afforded the opportunity to build those things over time. And that's where the model really started translating into something that's much more like a hierarchical model. And it's
Hmm.
been framed and visualized beautifully by Katie Vickovitz from the University of New Mexico and J. Lee Tucker from the University of South Florida into what they've called a socio-ecological model of recovery, which effectively is that layered approach. So there are legal, cultural components that inform community assets and resources that shape the social networks people have, that inform those kind of growth in personal qualities. But it's bi-directional. And a big part of my
Sure.
work is about how, if you make the recovery community sufficiently visible, accessible, and attractive, it
Hmm.
becomes dynamic in as much as it shapes societal attitudes and responses and beliefs. And I know that, you know, as somebody who's involved in NAR, the National Alliance of Recovery Residences, we're very keen on that idea of not having isolated houses on the hill where we
Hmm.
pretend there's nothing going on here, look away, we're not going to cause any problems, to a model which is much more assertive and in your face that says, look, recovery is something to be proud of, and we will contribute to the well-being of the community. And in that
Right.
way, one of the ways where recovery capital isn't like financial capital is it's generative. If if people go into recovery and build their recovery capital, it creates a ripple effect out to their family, their
That's
neighborhood,
right.
their community, and that's
Hmm.
part of the rationale for, I think, what you were referring to earlier, that in essence, that the model is really around saying this is not a static phenomenon. This is why it's so
Hmm.
important that we think not only of the recovery capital of the individual, but the recovery capital of the workforce. So one of our other measures is the FWARBs, the Peer Wellbeing and Recovery Building Scale. We've been looking at organizational measures of recovery capital. We've piloted something in Michigan. We have a measure of, well, one of the things I'm working on just now, which we're going to publish in the UK on the 17th of December, is a family recovery capital framework, which attempts to start
Really exciting.
operationalizing how we count the recovery capital, not just of the individual, but of the family unit. And that's based
Right.
on work we've done in England over the last 2 to 3 years, where we've identified 5 domains of family recovery capital that we'll try and operationalize into a visualization map and a questionnaire.
That is really thrilling. What a smart yeah, and hearing you describe it as a social worker in my training, it makes perfect sense. We need to always be looking at family systems, and in our experience at Cause Change Collaborative, we were often, as you probably know, we're often hearing from folks pursuing recovery about the challenges with connecting again to family, and as their recovery capital grows as individuals and they move further along, under kind of what's the word, finding the right middle ground between family and themselves and their life and everything else they want to do. And it's such an important work. I'm thrilled to hear that you are
Well,
in there doing that.
and one of the dilemmas we wanted to answer was we partnered with a UK organisation called AdFam. It's a family support organisation, and they published
Mhm.
a report basically about, uh, based on interviews with people in recovery, about how important families were to them, how much of it families mattered. And it was ironic because we'd recently done some stuff in the northeast of England where we interviewed a whole pile of people going into residential treatment, and their response was much more of the, I don't want my families anywhere near me. They're the cause, they're the reason why I'm here in the first place. They want nothing to do with
Wow.
them. And so effectively the kind of challenge for us was what changes? Was this just an odd set of
Mm-hmm.
people? Or and one of the things that strikes me as really interesting is for many people, part of their motivation for entering treatment is a complete breakdown in trust with people generally, but
Mm-hmm.
specifically because of historical trauma and
Mm-hmm.
antecedent issues, specifically with their families. And a part of that recovery journey, and it's challenging because it's asynchronous. It happens for family members much later, who will often start by saying, yeah, yeah, I've heard all this before, but this time you're really serious and this time you mean it. And in addition to
Mm-hmm.
which, you know, I am not leaving you alone with my wallet, my purse, the television, whatever, because we all know what happened in the past when you've been left alone with these things. So there's a very slow spiraling dynamic shift in trust relationships. And the
Mm-hmm.
re-establishment of any kind of trust process is like is
Mm-hmm.
linked to both the individual's journey, but also the post-traumatic growth of the family member. If you think of addiction within a family as a process of change over time. So for me, there's something really, really important about moving away from the traditional addiction model, which is basically so individually focused, to a family
Mm-hmm.
model, which is about this dynamic process of growth and change in both the individual
Right.
and their families. So, yeah.
Right. And as you've said, fundamental to recovery capital, that building of community. It may or may not be familial community depending on the individual and their circumstances, but it certainly could be in other circumstances. And
And
right,
I think
the
for us,
nuanced layers there. Hmm.
yeah, it's so important to recognize the fact that the family can constitute negative recovery capital at the start of the journey. And a huge
Hmm.
barrier can be ongoing dysfunctional family relationships and family ruptures in the process. So, for me, I think that's such an important thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, gosh, you've helped us just in this conversation think differently, talk actively about family relationships, and I appreciate that. And Um, and I also think it's really interesting that you are involved in so many pieces of kind of component parts of what recovery capital can look like. How do we measure it? How do we capture that data? What does it mean for family systems, for communities, these sort of larger framing? And I also recently heard a presentation that you did with Dr. Corey Vilsan, where you all talked about some of the stigma that includes people's experiences based on their identities, who they are in the world, and how that impacts their
Yeah.
access to recovery capital and recovery opportunities. And so, anyway, I just want to say thank you on a personal level. I'm really appreciative
Oh,
of your work. Um,
my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for that. And look, it feels
yeah.
to me that people get so bogged down in the minutiae of what they do. I'm in a fortunate position where I get to see a lot of stuff that goes on. And I think it's also really important to say we're nowhere near the end of the science journey or the measurement journey around recovery capital. We have a long way to go. And there's a wonderful young academic at Texas Tech University who is talking about identity capital as a core part of the recovery capital journey. Now, I'm certainly
Right.
not arrogant enough to think, no, no, my model's definitive. And I really like this idea of identity capital, which before you started recording, we were talking about New Zealand and the Maori culture. Well, if you have an identity capital as a potential metric, you can include those elements of culture, which we've struggled with. It seems to me that's
Right.
been a gap in our models.
Right.
And when you go to, especially when you go to a collectivist culture, like the Maori or Pacifica cultures in New Zealand, there's
Hmm.
a very, very dominant element of recovery that's about relationship with and reintegration with culture. Just as we've been talking about family, it's a similar kind of dynamic
Right.
that it can be at the start. When I used to work in Australia, we would frequently talk about Aboriginal addiction as like double stigmatizing. Because this was a group of people who were already largely rejected by the dominant white culture. But through
Hmm.
addiction, they were rejected by their own cultural heritage groups. And so you had like a double stigmatizing jeopardy as part of the journey. Now, reintegration effectively means there can be at least some kind of building of
Hmm.
positive capital through that process.
Yeah.
And as they do that, they also become kind of viable, acceptable role models that builds the capital of the whole community. So that's the dynamic, bi-directional part.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that bidirectional piece is important, and that kind of intersectional layers, right, of
Absolutely.
identity, and whether,
Well,
as you say, you're already part of a strong cultural heritage that you identify with, that it could be supportive, even if you currently have some distance or isolation. It's really, really fascinating.
and I
I'm
think one
grateful.
of the things for me that so I do a lot of work around asset-based community development and what are the
Hmm.
resources in your community. And it's really
Hmm.
important to realize that that can't be a directory. So it could be like, let's say, for instance, you and I both were heroin addicts living on the same street, but there's a Alcoholics Anonymous group that meets in our local church, but it's full of old white men. So it potentially is a resource for me, but it's potentially
Hmm.
not a resource for you, particularly
Right. Or
if
less
your
appealing
addiction.
resource. Yeah, less
Yeah,
likely to use. Hmm.
well, and then doubly so for a woman of a different ethnicity or who might be 18 or 17, who might think, I just
Right.
couldn't possibly go into that unit or like, yeah, so say a
That's right.
Muslim woman of 17 wouldn't, for all kinds of cultural reasons, even think about that, ignoring the fact that it's Alcoholics Anonymous
Hmm.
predicated on a
Hmm.
Christian religious
Hmm.
worldview. So I think
Right.
that notion of community capital is intrinsically bound up with your identity and your culture because it's
Of
not just
course.
about what's available, it's what's about what's accessible as well to
That's
you.
right. That's right. Hmm. And gosh, if that's not a good transition to recovery housing, right? So as you know, we work almost exclusively kind of in the recovery housing sphere at this time. And one of the most common things that we hear from folks in recovery who are interested in recovery housing and see it as a potential path in their recovery supports and their kind of ongoing movement forward is this lack of access that you described. So it's not always availability. It's often, well, that house isn't going to work for me because of whatever circumstance. Maybe that house is not affirming of my use of medication as part of my recovery, or that house doesn't allow women. It's a man only house, or
Yes,
whatever the circumstances might
absolutely.
be. And so it's interesting to kind of layer that in as well. I'm wondering, one of the pieces of research that you did a while back that we were really interested in was in Florida, and it was with the Florida NAR affiliate FAR, and there were some kind of standout pieces for us. And I'm curious, from your perspective, are there any takeaways there that you would want people who may not be particularly well versed in recovery housing to be thoughtful about in regards to recovery capital and recovery housing?
So let me start by saying you're in a wonderfully privileged position compared to the UK, Australia, and New Zealand by having recovery housing. So in
Right,
two things, one in the Oxford House model, which is not something I talk about a lot, you have an incredibly well evidenced, well established model. Admittedly, for people who I think are pretty well down the line on their recovery journey, nonetheless,
right.
a phenomenally well evidenced model. And then you have NAR, and NAR really does an amazing job of providing accredited recovery housing and making sure it meets fundamental basic safety standards for people.
hmm
So important.
Right.
So, what else can we say? It
Yeah.
seems to me that you can't have a recovery ecosystem without having meaningful pathways, because then you're back into that magical thinking about here's our magical cure for addiction. Well, recovery housing is a fabulous transitional model from prison, jail, homelessness, treatment that gives people the time and space within a peer driven social model to build the
hmm
recovery capital that will sustain them. And
hmm
in one of the studies we did in Virginia, we were able to demonstrate that people who start with low levels of recovery capital, if they're provided with more intensive support, they will do better. Likewise, typically, there are a number of factors that are commonly associated with lower recovery capital. Being a woman, being older, having a history of incarceration, a history of mental health problems. Well, they do worse potentially because the services aren't really set up so well for those populations.
Right.
So the ideal
hmm
would be, you mentioned intersectionality earlier. Can you have specialist housing that meet the specific needs of particular groups? Like I was in New
Yes.
Zealand last week, and there's a wonderful part of their what would be a level four recovery house. So it's effectively a kind of therapeutic community where women, well, parents with children have special accommodation so that the mother or father gets the child up in the morning, they make them breakfast. They take them either to the creche or the local school. They then attend
hmm
the full day program at the therapeutic community. They then pick up the child. They make the child dinner. They put the child to bed. They also have a free house on site where relatives can come and stay for the weekend without paying any rent or fees or anything like
Wow.
that. And it's just an astonishing, innovative resource. Now, it seems to me the basic recovery housing model, and we've now done a lot of work in a number of states, is pretty well evidenced. We don't know well
hmm
enough what the essential elements are, and we don't know well enough why there is such variation house to house. I suspect
hmm
it's a dynamic of the recovery house manager, the peer recovery specialists, who haven't been subjected to anywhere near enough research study,
hmm
organizational factors, and then structural factors, including funding. But the key thing always for me is pathways. If you're not going to pretend you believe in magic bullets, You need to think about where people come from, what they get ancillary or
Right.
wraparound, and where they go to afterwards. And we need to understand that better. But it strikes me that we have very little recovery housing in the UK, and
Hmm.
it's a huge gap in having a meaningful system. And
Hmm.
well, yeah, there's a lot still to learn. I think the NAR model combined with Oxford houses provides you with an incredibly strong foundation and basis for building meaningful long term pathways to recovery for people.
Yeah, I agree. And it's exciting because there, as you say, there is absolutely development happening in this space. There's this ongoing kind of evolution of ideas and how to implement best practices in a more consistent way and across the board. Several states, I'm sure you're aware, in the United States have, including Texas, where we're headquartered, have moved towards limiting state funds to homes that are either Oxford homes or are NAR accredited in their respective states with this, but that there are funds in some states to go through that process is a beautiful thing as well, right? There's
Sure.
this evolution of kind of support for the system, which is like really exciting to be a part of. Okay, so gosh, I want to ask you a million questions, and yet I want to be
I'm afraid
responsive.
I've only got about 5 more minutes because I have to go to
Okay,
my
I'll be
train
quick.
in 5 minutes if that's okay.
Okay, let's do the last question real quick. So, first of all, thank you so much for your time, David, all the time, and your research and your work. And really, it's great to get to chat with you always. I'm always interested in hearing what you're thinking about and curious specifically right now if you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with viewers, things you think people should know that we aren't talking about as a community
Yes.
of people
And
who
part
care.
of that is going to be about our collaboration. I'm delighted that we're going to be collaborating moving forward. And almost it follows directly on from what I was saying about the peer recovery specialist house manager model. We're going to be
Mm,
working in part on the peer wellbeing and recovery building scale. And it seems to me like the visible, accessible, attractive recovery icons or champions in an area are a strong predictor from a public health point of view of the contagion or spread of recovery. Yet our knowledge
mhm.
of that group of people and their needs and how we avoid burnout, stress, distress, and support them to have developmental careers has been so completely neglected. And it's such an exciting thing that we're going to be looking at. And then the second thing for me that's a massive part of my work just now is the inclusive recovery cities model that really is about saying, how can we? So if I was to come up with a equation for recovery capital now, it would be what are the personal, social, and community resources you have or can tap into, multiplied
Mhm.
by what are the conditions that prevail in the communities you exist in that create the conditions that allow recovery capital to flourish? And effectively having the two halves of that equation gives us two things to count. And we're doing okay in counting the first of them. We're doing not so good in counting the second, or we haven't really started. And really, this is the natural legacy of the work on recovery oriented systems of care, recovery ecosystems, all of those kind of things. But they tended to be disappointingly descriptive. And
Mhm.
for me, the question of, yeah, that's all very well, but how do we, if we don't count things, we can't test them empirically properly. And so it seems
Right.
to me the ideas have flourished without really adequate empirical testing. And I hope that's something we can do moving forward.
I hope so too. Thank you, Dr. Best, for all of your insights and your time and your movement forward in the field. We're excited to be a part of it. Thank you. I hope you go catch your train and rest
Oh
well.
no, no, no
Thanks again.
problem. And look, Lee, if we need to follow up, if there's anything else you wanted to ask me, just let's arrange another time. But
Yeah,
look,
you got it. Sounds good. Okay,
you
I'm going
take
to turn the
care. Have a
recording off.
great day.
Thank you and safe travels home. It was great to connect.
Perfect. You take care. Thanks very much. Bye bye.
Bye.